Once the ice melted, those boulders were simply just deposited around the landscape in these unusual positions, and they've been just sitting there in these unusual positions for thousands of years. There would have been trees all over this landscape as well, but they only would have had a very shallow layer of soil underneath the trees. And once the forest around Ireland began to be cut down, once the land was cleared of the trees, the wind from the sea swept away all the soil eventually. It left us with this very, very barren but very beautiful landscape. Also, we're going to begin to see some famine walls around the landscape. So these are walls of stone climbing up through fields of stone. Now, no crops would be grown in fields of stone, no livestock being reared in fields of stone either. So these walls have no practical purpose. They were built purely as a work relief scheme, a means of offering employment to people during the very desperate time of the famine. So the famine is the darkest period of Irish history, without a doubt, but also easily the most important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the famine now. And once we see the famine walls, they're beginning to come into view ahead of us in the distance on the hills. So you can see these just walls of stone creeping up through the fields of stone. So they almost act as physical reminders, scars effectively from that dark period of our history. The famine occurred between 1845 and 1849, and during this time about 1 million people died from starvation and associated diseases, and a further 1.5 million people would have emigrated at this time, mainly to North America, but also they would have went to the UK. A lot of people would have been forcibly sent to penal colonies in Australia as well, and just generally Irish people would spread themselves all over the world at this point. Prior to the famine, Ireland had a population of about 8 million people, and even when you combine the populations of the Republic and Northern Ireland today, it only comes to about 7 million people. So we're still about 1 million people short of our pre-famine population. This is an extremely unusual situation. In fact, Ireland is the only country in the whole world, barring a couple of very small micro-states, that has a smaller population now than it did 200 years ago. For a little context, during this period prior to the famine, Ireland would have had a larger population than Egypt. And now Egypt has over 100 million people. And even if you were to compare our population growth with our neighbouring countries in England, Scotland and Wales, if our population were to grow at the same rate as those countries, you would expect Ireland to have a population of about 30 million people or so, as compared to the 7 that we actually have. So even when you take into account that we're a small landmass, we're actually a very small little population here in Ireland. It's actually quite sparsely populated. So the cause of the famine was the potato blight, which caused the potatoes to rot in the ground, and this was hugely damaging for a number of reasons. The majority of land in Ireland wasn't owned by native Irish people, but generally British landlords who would often run their estates from back in their homes in Britain. So they had little emotional attachment to the land and much less the people on it. So when the crops failed, the landlords in Ireland were generally quite heartless in kicking their tenants off the land. So it was effectively an opportunity for them. At this time, a lot of people were looking to move away from crop farming, moving to more profitable beef and dairy farming, much less labour intensive. So when an opportunity arose, when their tenants couldn't pay their rent, it was a good opportunity for them to kick them off their land and then convert to a more profitable form of agriculture. What little land was owned by the native Irish was generally the smallest possible plots of land and the poorest quality plots of land, where the only crop that could suitably grow was the humble potato crop. So when it failed, it was really devastating, and there was very little the Irish people could even do. In order to claim any form of relief from the government, you had to effectively give up your land, and this was effectively another quite large land grab at the time, and it was really devastating to the Irish population. Mass starvation and mass emigration would occur from this point onwards. The British government initially were quite quick to help to aid Ireland buying up a huge amount of corn, staving off the worst effects of the famine in its first year. But following this first year, then that government were replaced in the UK by the Whigs, who were much less sympathetic to the people of Ireland, and they adopted a laissez-faire policy, whereby they felt that the best thing to do, effectively, was to do nothing. So because of the actions of the landowners at the time, as well as the inactions of the UK government, a lot of people in Ireland would feel that the famine in Ireland was an artificial famine. Because there was still plenty of food being grown in Ireland at that time. It's thought that we were growing enough food to feed at least double our population, but the majority of it was being exported even as people were dying on the streets in their hundreds of thousands. So it brought about a lot of anger at that time, a renewed hunger for independence, and it would have another other profound impacts onto Irish culture and society. So I might talk a little bit about Ireland these days now, and how maybe some of our cultural traits could date back to the famine. I think it's made us a much more empathetic nation. I think that we remember a lot of the aid that was given to us by foreign people at the time. There's a particularly nice story of the Choctaw tribe, the Native American tribe, and they gave a very generous donation of corn to the people of Ireland during the famine. And this has been commemorated with a sculpture of an Indian headdress outside of the village of Middleton by the Middleton Distilleries in Cork, if you happen to be visiting there. But more recently, the Choctaw tribe were going through their own very difficult period during the pandemic, and there were fundraisers online to raise money for their communities, and when word reached Ireland that the Choctaw tribe were in need, donations came flooding in from all over Ireland with messages of support and thanks for their aid given to us back in the mid-19th century. So I think it's a really nice story of this age from over 170 years ago being remembered and reciprocated. I think the famine also had a big impact on the Irish language. Prior to the famine, there was still a large proportion of the Irish population speaking Irish on a daily basis. But once people could no longer make a living from the land, once they were forced to move into the towns and the cities where the language of the government and the language of commerce generally was English, Irish people began to move towards the English language in order to give them a better opportunity in life as they were to grow older. So they'll have parents kind of dissuading their children from speaking English in favor of dissuading their children rather from speaking Irish in favor of speaking English. And the Irish language has never really recovered. Only about 2% of Irish people speak Irish on a daily basis these days. It's taught in schools, but it's taught effectively as a foreign language, and it's just not used in daily life in Ireland. All our road signs are bilingual in Irish and in English. There are small things like this that are an attempt to preserve, possibly even revive the Irish language, but in general the level of fluency amongst Irish people in speaking Irish is actually very poor. This year I'm trying to make a better effort to learn more of the Irish language myself. So this year I had my first child, and I guess it's made me think a lot about Irish culture and heritage, what I want to pass on to the next language. So I am making an effort to learn a bit of Irish these days, but it is slow and difficult progress. I think the famine had a big impact on Irish views towards food as well. I think a lot of people claim that Ireland has a kind of a survivor's guilt when it comes towards food, that we see food as purely a source of nourishment rather than as a source of pleasure. And we've also never really managed to hold on to the best of our raw quality ingredients in Ireland. I think a lot of our best produce has been exported, and we've never really held on to them here to develop a strong culture of cuisine. But we do make good food in Ireland. What we are best known for is good raw quality ingredients, particularly beef and dairy. But agriculture is no longer the driving force of the Irish economy as it once was. Tech and pharmaceuticals is really what drives the Irish economy these days. So Ireland has a low corporate tax rate and a relatively well-educated native English-speaking workforce. And for this reason, a huge amount of tech and pharmaceutical companies have their European headquarters here in Ireland. So in tech, in Dublin, you have the likes of Meta, X, LinkedIn, Indeed. They all have their European headquarters in Dublin. Apple have their European headquarters in Cork. But it's a little bit of an uncertain time in the tech industry in Dublin. So you're probably aware that X, formerly Twitter, was bought out by Elon Musk just over a year ago, and he immediately laid off half the staff worldwide, which had a big impact on the European headquarters in Dublin, and that had also knock-on impacts on the other tech companies in Dublin. So Meta recently deciding not to move into a large new premises that they were due to move into in Dublin. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the tech industry in Dublin these days. Pharmaceuticals, though, still going great. So you have the likes of Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Boston Scientific. They all have huge operations around the country. So when you think about Irish products these days, I would say think less beef and butter and more Viagra, because that's what we're exporting around the world these days. But for now, going to keep an eye out for see what kind of animals we can see around the landscape. So mostly cows, not seeing too many sheep these days. Around this area somewhere, there should be actually a herd of alpacas. Oh, we've got some rabbits in the fields there as well. A lot of rabbits bouncing around the place there on our left hand side. But there is an alpaca farm around here. The farmer generally moves them to field, so we kind of never know where we're going to see them. But keep an eye out. They may initially look like sheep with quite long necks, but we'll keep an eye out and see where we can find the alpacas. But for now, as we're continuing on along the west coast, I'm going to play some of my favourite traditional Irish songs for you guys. Going to play Raglan Road and School Days Over by the Dubliners. Probably play a little bit of Tickled by a band called Keelan. It's a really kind of fast-paced traditional Irish song. But you can see the alpacas there in the field there just before the rainbow. I think that's a big herd of alpacas over there. So someone had the interesting idea of bringing these creatures over. I mentioned about this area here being famous for its knitwear. So someone decided to bring another woolly creature over to take advantage of that. So that's a pretty enterprising idea by them. But for now, for a little while, I'm going to be just letting the coastline and the beautiful landscapes do the work for me. The west coast of Ireland, I think, has always had a certain mystique to it, a lot of mystery. You think to the east you have Britain, so always a lot of familiarity there, going back thousands of years. Similar to the south in mainland Europe, the Celts would have come from mainland Europe, from France and from Spain, so again, little mystery to what's below us. Even up north, you know, we would have had a lot of Irish people being enslaved and brought to Iceland, so, you know, we kind of knew a little bit about the north as well. But the west, until relatively recently, has always been a big mystery in Ireland, so there's always a lot of mystique to it. There was a lot of mythology about a land called High Brazil out to the west coast, kind of Ireland's version of Atlantis, a land that appears from the ocean every now and again. So a lot of mythology, a lot of stories, a lot of mystique about the west coast. And it's a beautiful day along the coast today, particularly nice rainbow on our left hand side.